Welcome to Beyond the Lens, where history comes alive, and every documentary takes you deeper than ever before. History isn't just written in books. It's carved into ancient ruins, hidden beneath the oceans. For breathtaking this is a journey beyond the lens.
Standing in front of the Vatican today, St. Peter's Basilica appears as a fixed point in history. The stones project a sense of permanence, as if the building simply willed itself into existence. This aerial view shows the massive footprint of the basilica and its surrounding square, highlighting the enormous spatial requirements of the project. But this finished structure hides a chaotic 120-year construction timeline that nearly ended in total failure. To understand the complexity of what was built, we have to look at what was paved over. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine ordered a massive church built outside the city walls, directly over the traditional burial site of the Apostle Peter. For over 1,000 years, Old St. Peter's Basilica stood as one of the most significant sites in Europe. But by the late 1400s, the structure was failing. The foundations were sinking, the walls were visibly leaning, and dangerous cracks crept along the ceilings. In 1503, Pope Julius II evaluated the structural damage and made a choice that stunned his contemporaries. Rather than reinforcing the ancient walls, he ordered demolition crews to tear the entire basilica down. While the old building was hazardous, removing it created an immediate problem for the Vatican. To replace a shrine that had stood for a millennium, the new design could not just be a functional repair. It had to be significantly more ambitious than the icon it replaced to justify its removal. To build it, the Pope hired Donato Bramante, an architect who immediately threw out the traditional, long rectangular layout used for most churches. Instead, he expanded the blueprint into a symmetrical, massive Greek cross design with 4 equal arms. A dome designed to be the largest in the world would rise over the center of those 4 intersecting arms. This interior view of the ancient Roman Pantheon shows the massive coffered ceiling and the open central oculus that defined early engineering. Bramante intended for his new dome to surpass this ancient Roman standard. But executing that design in the early 16th century meant working without modern steel frameworks, mechanical cranes, or computer stress modeling. Every piece of the basilica had to be built using primitive logistics. Thousands of craftsmen had to drag millions of pounds of stone, relying entirely on thick ropes, wooden pulleys, and animal power. Bramante's blueprint pushed existing technology to a breaking point. By designing at such an extreme scale, he committed the Vatican to a project that exceeded the mechanical capabilities of the time, leaving his successors to solve the engineering problems he created. Progress stalled when Bramante died in 1514. He left his master plan completely untested and largely unfinished. Scrambling to fill the leadership vacuum, the Vatican brought in a sequence of elite Renaissance artists and architects, including Raphael and Giuliano da Sangallo. These conflicting visions caused the project to lose focus. Each new architect altered portions of the original blueprint, replacing them with their own designs. These changes had immediate physical consequences on the construction site. Stone walls that took years to build were occasionally torn down to accommodate a new architect's preference. This cycle of building and dismantling drained the Vatican's treasury. To keep up with the costs, the church relied on controversial fundraising methods, right as the European political landscape began to fracture. Separated from its original creator, the project became a sunken cost obligation. It was a bloated blueprint that trapped future generations in a cycle of constant redesigns and stalled progress. Decades after the initial demolition, the Vatican site was a landscape of unfinished walls, rotting scaffolding, and massive debt. By this stage, the project had already outlived its first 2 generations of architects. For those working on the site, a completed church was a distant, moving target that none of them expected to live to see. Facing structural and financial collapse, the Vatican needed someone who could finally unite the fractured blueprints and salvage the remaining structure. They turned to Michelangelo. At the time, he was an aging artist who vehemently protested the assignment, insisting to the Pope that he was a sculptor, not an architect. Yet he was the only one capable of finally realizing the central structure. He engineered the massive ribbed dome that still spans the Roman sky today. Next time, we will examine how a reluctant sculptor took command of this site and engineered one of the most significant architectural triumphs of the Renaissance. Look at St. Peter's Basilica today. At 15,000 square meters, it commands the Roman skyline, projecting absolute permanence and divine order. But if you stood on this exact spot in the year 1546, that order vanished. After 50 years of scattered construction, the site was a stagnant disaster, defined by rough, unfinished stone walls soaking in the rain. The project had completely stalled. Popes died in rapid succession. Ongoing wars drained the Vatican's coffers. Successive architects continuously ripped up the previous blueprints to insert their own ideas, leading to absolute structural chaos. Desperate, the papacy handed the entire project over to a 71-year-old sculptor who explicitly rejected the job and repeatedly reminded them he was not an architect. His name was Michelangelo. The first half-century of construction failed because it was driven by competing egos and bloated ambition. To get the massive site moving, the papacy desperately needed someone who cared more about structural reality than political grandstanding. Michelangelo was already the most famous artist in Europe. He commanded an undisputed mastery over stone, having already carved the illusion of soft, lifelike fabric into the heavy marble of his Pieta. He had also survived punishing, massive-scale commissions, like painting the massive ceiling of the Sistine Chapel entirely on his own. Because of this exact history, he actively feared the crushing expectations and endless politics of fixing the basilica. He initially refused the commission. However, viewing the enormous task as an act of personal devotion rather than a path to more fame, he eventually gave in and took control. His very first move as chief architect was administrative and aggressive. He threw out 50 years of complicated, contradictory blueprints left by his predecessors, replacing them with a unified, tightly organized layout. Michelangelo's total lack of interest in architectural glory was exactly what the project needed. By stripping away 5 decades of vanity, he forced the entire massive operation to focus strictly on physical harmony and structural strength. This structural diagram of the dome highlights the core engineering crisis. To dominate the Roman skyline, the dome had to be immense, but a solid stone structure of that size would generate so much intense downward force that it would inevitably buckle and collapse under its own dead weight. To solve this, Michelangelo engineered a structural deception. He split the dome into 2 distinct layers. By building a robust inner shell and a lighter outer shell with a hollow space between them, he drastically cut the total dead weight. He then designed a system of massive stone ribs to capture the remaining load. These ribs channeled the immense pressure down, away from the vulnerable center, and drove it safely into gigantic supporting floor piers built into the basilica floor. This precise math was executed with pure muscle. Thousands of laborers assembled the structure block by block, relying on wooden scaffolding, thick ropes, and custom-built lifting machines to hoist tons of stone hundreds of feet into the air. Michelangelo's double-shell dome provided a technical solution for height that had eluded builders since the Roman era. By proving that mathematical distribution could overcome the literal weight of stone, he turned a massive engineering roadblock into a repeatable architectural template. However, Michelangelo never saw the finished dome. He died in 1564, while the immense structure was only partially built. But this time, construction didn't stall. Knowing his time was limited, Michelangelo had prepared exhaustive, detailed drawings and physical wooden models to guide whoever came next. Because his instructions were so perfectly exact, the next generation of architects, Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana, were able to seamlessly take over, faithfully executing his plans to cap the lantern and finish the massive exterior. Later, architect Carlo Maderno assumed control. He took Michelangelo's core layout and extended the nave outward, finalizing the massive Latin cross footprint we recognize today. Michelangelo's true architectural genius lies in the system he created. He designed a structure so perfectly rational and documented it so thoroughly that other men could build it decades after he was in the ground. With the structural shell complete, generations of craftsmen descended on the interior. Over decades, they covered thousands of square meters of raw stone in polished marble, extensive gold leaf, and intricate mosaics. Then, Gian Lorenzo Bernini arrived to anchor the vast space. He erected a towering 30-meter bronze baldachin directly over the main altar, twisting its massive columns to intentionally dwarf the surrounding architecture. Bernini then moved outside, designing the sweeping geometry of St. Peter's Square. He engineered the massive colonnades to reach outward, visually embracing the millions of global pilgrims who would eventually arrive. Finally, in 1626, Pope Urban VIII consecrated the finished St. Peter's Basilica. The project spanned exactly 120 years, cycling through 20 different popes and absorbing the labor of 4 full generations. The building stands as a physical record of a century-long relay race. It is the result of a vision so structurally sound and artistically clear that it survived 20 changes in leadership and outlived every architect who touched the original plans.